In a comedic review for this book, they basically said that it's people going from one estate to another to talk stuff out. And in a sense it is that, but I think we can go a little bit deeper than that. Ivan Turgenev was born 1818 in Oryol. His parents' marriage was an incredibly unhappy one. His father Sergei came from an old noble family, but he managed to waste all of his money away pretty quickly. So in order to improve his financial state, he agreed to an arranged marriage to Varvara Lutavinova. She was 29 years old, really old for a bride for that time period, and she had a really nasty character, but she was incredibly rich. The pair had 3 children. Ivan was the second one, and the youngest, Sergei, died of epilepsy at a very young age. Because the marriage was an unhappy one, the father Sergei tried to spend as little time at home as possible until they finally separated in 1830. But what that did is that the mother ruled the household with an iron fist. She was strict, emotionally and physically abusive to her peasants and servants, but to her children as well. She did all she possibly could to get them the best education possible, but at the same time, the punishments for any misdeeds were incredibly harsh. Turgenev would later paint the portrait of his mother in his story Mumu, where a terrible landlady forces a serf to kill his only friend, his dog Mumu. 1827, the family moved to Moscow in order for the boys to receive their education. At 15 years old, Turgenev studied at the Moscow University. Around the same time, Turgenev experienced his first love and his first heartbreak. His beloved Ekaterina Shukshina chose his father instead of Ivan, a story that Turgenev would later describe in his story First Love. 1834, the family moved to St. Petersburg, where Ivan studied philology at the St. Petersburg University, and that's when he also started writing. He first dabbled in poetry. Some of his early poems were even published in Современник magazine. After university, Turgenev traveled to Europe to continue his education, and it was a formative experience for him because he saw the differences between the Russian Empire of the time and Europe, and he became sure that in order for Russia to improve, they needed to follow the example set by Western European countries. His whole life, Turgenev traveled from Europe to Russia and back, and that was a source of criticism for a while. How can he write about Russia when he doesn't even live in Russia? But Turgenev always had Russia's best interest at heart. In 1840s, Turgenev spent some time in Russia, where he met the literary elite of that time, like Zhukovsky, Gogol, Aksakov. He even met Pushkin and Lermontov briefly. In early 40s, Turgenev was still writing poetry, and one of his poems was highly praised by the famous critic of that time, Belinsky, that studied the lifelong friendship between the two. And it's thanks to Belinsky and the writer Nekrasov that Turgenev shifted away from Romanticism. In his personal life, he couldn't find much success for the longest time. He had affairs here and there, notably with a seamstress in his mother's estate, whom he was even willing to marry, but his mother threatened to disinherit him, so he left without this woman. He also had a fling with Leo Tolstoy's sister Maria. She allegedly even left her husband, expecting Turgenev to do something, but it never amounted to anything. But it was a source of the conflict between Leo Tolstoy and Turgenev for the longest time. The only true love in Turgenev's life was the French-Spanish singer Pauline Viardot, whom he first saw in St. Petersburg, 1843. Paulina was not the most beautiful woman out there, but beyond her beautiful singing voice, she supposedly was also a very charming woman. When Turgenev first met her, she was already married to an Italian critic, Louis Verdot, who was 20 years her senior, and she remained married to Louis until the very end. Turgenev's mother was not happy about this affair with the damned gypsy, and she stopped sending Turgenev money for 3 years. And so Turgenev, who followed the Viardot to Europe, was quite constrained in his financials, and he even lived with the Viardot for a little while. He even developed a friendship with Louis Viardot, and a little bit more than friendship with Polina, I guess. But in a plot twist, when Turgenev came back to his mother's estate 1849, he discovered that that seamstress that he had an affair with, she had a child, and Turgenev's mother has taken away the child away from her mother and has been raising her for the last 8 years. And we remember how caring Varvara was with her own children. So can you imagine what she was doing to this poor illegitimate child? Turgenev understood that he needed to take the child away from her, and he came up with the best idea, and he wrote to Polina Viardot asking her to take the child in. And she did, and so Pelageia, affectionately called Polina or Paulette, was raised in the Viardot household along with the 4 Viardot children. Most say that the relationship between her and Polina Viardot has always been strained, likely because of some jealousy over Turgenev's attention. That feud lasted until the very end, because in his will, Turgenev left everything to Polina Viardot, and that put Paulette in quite a pickle, because her husband has already managed to waste everything away by that point, so she didn't have much to go on in terms of money. She had 2 children, but those 2 never had children of their own, so the Turgenev line ended with them. But back to Turgenev. So he spent years on his education both in Europe and Russia, but he also started writing novels. He hit a little bit of a setback 1852 when, against censor's orders, he wrote a eulogy for Gogol after his death, and that was perceived as a rebellion against the government, and Turgenev was even arrested, spent a month locked away, and then he was sent off into basically house arrest to his estate, which was only lifted like 2 years later thanks to some connections that Turgenev had. Some say that the obituary was obviously simply a pretext, that Turgenev was already believed too radical, too Western, his views on serfdom far too liberal. Despite this ordeal, Turgenev's A Sportman's Sketches was published that year, and that book is full of Turgenev's views on Russian nobility and serfdom. The censor who allowed that to be printed was fired by the personal order from Tsar Nikolai I. Turgenev painted the oppression of the peasant man, that the landowners were behaving in unbecoming manner and in an illegal manner, and a peasant man would be much happier if he were free. Revolutionary. Russian slavery, the so-called serfdom, would be only abolished under the rule of the next Tsar, the Alexander II. And in the same vein, most of the Turgenev's works would only be published after the death of Nikolai I. Rudin, 1856, Home of the Gentry in 59, On the Eve in 60, and Fathers and Sons, 62. But early 60s, Turgenev broke off from most of the Russian literary elite of the time, mostly because of his political views in a very highly politically active Russia. That happened with critic Dobrolюбов, for example, or writers Nekrasov and Gertsen. The rift with Leo Tolstoy was more on a personal grounds, and Turgenev and Dostoevsky famously hated each other. Some say it was simply because that Turgenev was the highest paid Russian author at the time, and Dostoevsky was always in debt, so he was always underpaid. But it was mostly also because of the political views of both authors. Turgenev was highly westernized, kind of on the European path, and Dostoevsky believed in the Russia has its own way kind of situation. And 1863, Turgenev installed himself in Baden-Baden along with the Viardots and started building his connections with the European literary elite. He was in correspondence with many, many authors like William Thackeray, Charles Dickens, Émile Zola, Guy de Maupassant, and many, many more. But Turgenev dedicated a lot of his time into popularizing Russian literature in Europe. Along with Louis Verdot, they translated a lot of Turgenev's own works into French, for example, but they also tried to do the same for other Russian authors, such as Pushkin, for example. The relationship with Leo Tolstoy was mended in 1978. They spoken highly of each other's works from that point on. The hatred with Dostoevsky remained. Dostoevsky based his great author Karmazinov in Demons on Turgenev, calling him rather unkindly a talentless literary person. Turgenev, in a letter to Sultakov-Shchedrin, called Dostoevsky the Russian Marquis de Sade. They were ruthless back then. These late years for Turgenev were probably the height of his popularity. His visit to Russia in 78-79, a true triumph, but his health was not what it used to be. He was suffering from the pains of the gout. He was later diagnosed with angina pectoris and thorakalgia, something like that. And by 1883, he couldn't sleep without morphine. He continued working until the very end. He dictated his last work to Paulina une fin, basically right before his death, and he passed away in 1983 in Bougival, France. Fathers and Sons, more accurately translated as Fathers and Children, is the most famous work by Turgenev, so let's recap and we will get into the themes afterwards. Historical context that is important is that the book is set in 1859, on the eve of the great reforms of the Alexander II that started 1861 with the Edict of Emancipation, i.e. serfdom abolishment. The book opens with Nikolai Petrovich Kirsanov waiting for his son Arkady to return from university. As we wait, the narrator backfills some story into Nikolai. Importantly, after his wife's death, he spent a lot of time in St. Petersburg along with Arkady, but lately his estate was demanding more and more attention, so he moved back to the estate and hasn't seen his son in a little while. Arkady brings a friend from university along with him, a doctor by the name of Evgeny Bazarov, and they plan to stay in Marina for a couple of weeks before heading out to see Bazarov's parents. While traveling to Marina, Nikolai sheepishly informs Arkady that he is now in a relationship with the 23-year-old peasant girl named Fenichka. Nikolai is very embarrassed about it, but Arkady is not concerned at all. He even feels kind of superior to his father, that he can be now generous with him and not bother him about it. We later also learn that Nikolai and Fenichka have a 6-month-old child, a boy, and Arkady doesn't mind that either. He's just happy to have a brother. At the estate we meet Pavel, Nikolai's brother. His backstory is that he used to be a great officer, very good looking and charming. He had risen to captain pretty quickly, but then he met a woman, a Princess R, and he fell madly in love with her. She used to show him a lot of affection, but she soon cooled down to him, but he did not. So when she left for Europe, he resigned from his position in the military and followed after her. In Europe, she continued avoiding him, so he kind of got the message and returned back to Russia, but he was not the same. Nothing ever brought him purpose from that point on. And when some 10 years later he learned of Princess's death, he remained an old bachelor and he moved into the estate along with his brother Nikolai. Bazarov and Pavel instantly hate each other. Pavel is part of the old aristocracy that Bazarov hates, and Bazarov is from this new wave of nihilists who deny and reject everything, the authorities, church, even God. This animosity culminates in a confrontation at the dinner table where they both try to argue for their worldviews, and Bazarov seemingly comes out on top even. And after that, the boys decide to go to a nearby town to unwind. In town, they meet a man called Sitnikov, who is also a follower of Bazarov and nihilism, but he simply parrots everything that Bazarov says. While in town, the boys go to a ball where they are introduced to a woman, Anna Odintsova, a notable widow in the region. Arkady instantly believes himself to be in love, and even Bazarov, who previously denied even the possibility of love and described it as a simply physical thing, he also seems to be interested in Odintsova. She invites them to her estate, where they spend about 2 weeks. Odintsova spends all of her time with Bazarov. She's a calm and collected woman, but she's also very educated, and they seem to have a lot of things in common, and at the very least, they enjoy each other's company. Arkady gets relegated to Anna's younger sister Katya, who is shy and reserved, but also very sentimental, and they also enjoy each other's company, even though Arkady still believes himself to be in love with Odintsova. Bazarov and Odintsova, they see this mutual interest in each other, but they also are seemingly trying to test one another to make the other break first. At one point, Bazarov tells her that he's going to leave for his parents' estate just to see what she's going to do. All this culminates in a conversation where Bazarov is pushed to the brink and it tears the confession out of him. But the way that he says it, with this grand passion that borders on rage, it scares Odintsova, and she does not return his feelings, so Bazarov leaves the next day for his parents' place, taking Arkady with him. Odintsova ponders why she pushed him to this confession and whether or not she should have or could have reciprocated in his feelings, but comes to the conclusion that nothing is worth it to disrupt her peace, and she continues on with her life. The boys, meanwhile, travel to Bazarov's place, who are so very much excited to see their son. They don't have much. They are basically described as relics of the old times, especially Bazarov's mother, but they are incredibly loving and they are so proud of their son. Bazarov, though, is not a fan of affection and all of this doting and attention. It only annoys him, so he decides to leave only after a few days. During this time, the crack in Arkady and Bazarov's relationship also grows. Bazarov, having failed the test of love, tries to reconcile who he is with this new feeling, and that makes him more and more bitter. And Arkady also starts to understand who himself is and how different he is from his friend, and thus the chasm between them grows more and more. They travel to Marina. On the way, they step by Odintsova's place, but quickly understand that it was a bad idea and they are not welcome, so they leave the same day. In Marina, Bazarov throws himself into work, but Arkady is more and more restless, so one day he just packs a bag and heads for Odintsova's place, where he first sees Katya, and he is very excited by that fact. In Marina, one day Bazarov meets Fenishka in the garden. She is gathering flowers, and they chat for a bit. Fenishka is a nice, quiet girl. She is friendly with Bazarov because he's helped her with her son once, and so she's quite taken aback when he randomly kisses her. She runs away, and Bazarov does not fully even understand why he did what he did, but that was witnessed by Pavel. Pavel, we'll later learn, also has some feelings towards Fenishka. Fenishka reminds him of that Princess R that he used to be in love with, and he goes to Bazarov and challenges him to a duel. The next morning, they duel with pistols. Pavel shoots but misses, and Bazarov shoots and shoots Pavel in the leg. Pavel even wants to continue on, but Bazarov says that he's no longer a duelist but a doctor, and he kind of bandages Pavel up, and after that he leaves Marina for good. Pavel confronts Fenishka about what happened, and having made sure that she is truly in love with Nikolai, he tells Nikolai to marry Fenishka, basically giving him his blessing. At Odintsova's estate, Arkady and Katya spend all of their time together. They grow closer and closer. When Bazarov arrives at the estate, the boys grow further apart. One day, Arkady and Katya overhear the conversation between Anna and Bazarov, where Anna speculates that Arkady still has feelings for her and she might want to pursue him. And so Arkady instantly proclaims his love for Katya and proposes on the spot. Bazarov says his farewells to Anna, and then he also says farewell to Arkady, saying that Arkady is not meant for the life that Bazarov intends to live, and that Arkady is doing everything right for himself. They say their farewells, and Bazarov leaves, and Arkady almost instantly forgets all about his friend when he's sitting next to his Katya. Bazarov goes home and once again tries to throw himself into work, but one day he's helping with the autopsy and he cuts himself and gets infected. He knows it to be fatal, so he sends for Odintsova. He's delirious, and when he once again proclaims his love for her, she kisses him on the forehead, and he passes away soon after. In the last chapter that serves as an epilogue, we learn of the characters' fates. Nikolai married Fenichka, Arkady married his Katya, and they all live happily in Marina. Pavel moved away to Europe to spend his last years there in the company of a wonderful Englishman. Odintsova also got married to some statesman, not out of great love, but out of convenience. And somewhere in the countryside, there is a grave that nobody remembers about, but the two parents who still go to visit the grave of their son, Evgeny Bazarov. Fathers and Sons is known first and foremost as the novel about nihilism. It came out right at the epicenter of that movement. And one of the most interesting aspects of it for me is the ever-long debate of life imitates art versus art imitates life. Oscar Wilde would passionately argue for the first sometime later, but Turgenev interestingly serves as the kind of proof of both. Bazarov was created as a composite of various characters that Turgenev saw in Russia in the 1850s, but Bazarov also became the blueprint for anybody who believed himself to be nihilist from that point on. So if you were to ask whether or not nihilists existed before Bazarov, yes, they did, but they only came fully formed once Bazarov came on stage. Story has it that Turgenev was traveling by train somewhere, I think from Moscow to St. Petersburg, and he met a Dr. D who was traveling to get a new cure for anthrax. When Turgenev said that he was a famous author, Doctor responded with, "That does not interest me," and kind of stopped talking to Turgenev. And while this response most likely came from his poor social skills rather than true disrespect, Turgenev remembered him. And thus this unnamed doctor became the basis for Bazarov. Turgenev would also add characteristics of a different doctor, of Viktor Yakushin, a known Democrat and member of a number of illegal parties at the time. Bazarov also expresses a lot of views and opinions of Turgenev's former colleagues, a critic Dobrolubov and writer Chernyshevsky, the known nihilists of that time. And thus Turgenev merged all of their ideology, characters, mannerisms, and behaviors, and Bazarov emerged as this prototype for all nihilists. This was further solidified by critic Pisarev, who sang praises to the book and named Bazarov as the ideal nihilist. Chernyshevsky would also say that every young man that came to see him because of his political views, they were all Bazarov, they were all talking and behaving as Bazarov did. All this makes the book an interesting artifact of its time. It portrays this atmosphere of the society, the zeitgeist of it. But does it work now? While Turgenev puts his nihilist character at center stage, he is also depicting the ever-present generational conflict. But for me personally, this conflict is spoiled by Bazarov, who is a deeply unlikable character. He's disrespectful, rude, and blasé, and that all makes it very difficult for me to engage with him properly. He's also very prideful and feels it beneath himself to explain anything to anybody, and that does not help either. My instinct is to grab and shake him, because this nonchalance that reads as disrespect is not only not an attractive quality, but it is also not conducive to a conversation. Hell, maybe I've already transitioned into the parent category and the youth is all like that, and I'm just over here shaking my fist at them and yelling for them to get off my lawn? Well, that's not good. And I absolutely love the argument that Bazarov is actually a smart and strong man, and thus he deserves our respect and love. And I think we've already moved past us praising people solely for these qualities, especially if they are lacking in any other qualities, especially socially speaking. And critics make a case that this nihilist mindset and behavior are ever present. I think there was a group recently that was kind of in the same vein as Bazarov, anarchists maybe, like burn it all down and somebody else will build it up back again. And I do think that this disillusionment with the system creeps up quite often, especially in the younger generations. And so the book is kind of timeless, especially if you move away from the minutiae and the details of the time period, like the problems of the peasants and the aristocracy. The story is universal. So we have this character of Bazarov at center stage. Who is he? He's a doctor, he's a nihilist. Socially, he is a so-called разночинец, a term used to describe people who are not part of any legal class of that Russian Empire at the time, mostly people who come from not so noble heritage, but who managed to get themselves educated to become somebody like a doctor, for example. Personal characteristics I've already mentioned. He's rude, he's cold, he's tactless, straight up vulgar sometimes. That all paints a rather unpleasant picture of a man destined to be alone. And the main emotion in Bazarov is anger and spite. All possible situations he approaches as such. He's angry at Kirsanov, he's angry at Odintsova. Even his love confessions reads as him shaking with rage. She is scared of him in that moment. It was passion beating in him, strong and heavy, passion that resembled anger and was perhaps akin to it. Turgenev seems to show us that you cannot build much on anger, that Bazarov's entire worldview is not sustainable, and that's why he doesn't make it in the end. His nihilism is not constructive. By the very nature of it, by rejecting everything and denying everything without much thought as to what comes next. Stephen Lowell puts it rather succinctly as such. Russian nihilism negated not the normative significance of the world or the general meaning of human existence, but rather a particular social, political, and aesthetic order. Despite their name, the Russian nihilists did hold beliefs, most notably in themselves and in the power of their doctrine to effect social change. It is, however, the vagueness of their positive programs that distinguishes the nihilists from the revolutionary socialists who followed them. While Bazarov, when speaking of nihilism, says "we" a lot, we only get to see two of his followers, Arkady and Sitnikov. It is therefore unclear whether or not these nihilists exist at all, or if there is only a handful of them, like Pavel suggested in the beginning. But even if you look at the two we get to see, Sitnikov is a full-on parody of Bazarov, crying damn les autorités, damn with the authorities, without truly understanding the meaning behind it. Bazarov mostly rolls his eyes at Sitnikov, saying that he needs people like him to do the dirty work. But in the cruel twist of fate, Sitnikov ends up the follower of Bazarov to continue with his ideology after Bazarov's death, and isn't that ironic? Arkady at university has fallen under the influence of his charismatic friend, but he also does not understand or embrace what nihilism is, so when he gives it up in favor of other things, it is without a struggle or doubt. And so Bazarov stands alone against the world. Bazarov as a character faces two conflicts, one external, one internal. The external conflict is depicted through his confrontations with Pavel, and the internal through his feelings for Odintsova. The first conflict is obvious from the get-go. Turgenev uses all possible tools to portray it, starting with their opposing physical descriptions, drawing attention to their hands, for example, to their instant dislike of each other. A savvy reader would also notice the similarities between the characters, which probably only serves to aggravate their conflict even more. They're both proud and sure of their beliefs, and they both also fail the test of love. But through them, the author shows this conflict of differing worldviews and, in a sense, a generational conflict. Pavel shows faith and belief in the old traditional way, and Bazarov argues to reject it all, burn it all down, and let somebody else build it up again. We need to say that Turgenev gently pokes fun at both the old aristocracy and the new wave of nihilists. In his notes, he says that he was trying to portray the very best, the most educated of noblemen, but if the cream is bad, then what is there to say about the milk, implying that even the best of aristocracy is very much out of touch with reality. And while the nihilist mindset is not constructive, the old traditional way also needs to change and adapt. And this external conflict comes to a climax in the duel scene, but neither party really comes out on top. Bazarov sets off on the path towards his own death in his various farewells, but Pavel, while he survives, he's also a dead man walking. Lit up by the brilliant daylight, his beautiful emaciated head lay on the white pillow like the head of a dead man. And indeed, he was a dead man. Turgenev doesn't really present an outcome to this conflict. Neither party wins. Somebody else would need to enact a change. Internal conflict for Bazarov is the test of love, something that the authors like to do to their protagonist. Bazarov first denies even the possibility of feelings. He reduces it to the physical thing. He makes fun of Pavel for his obsession with his Princess R. Sensuality and frivolity, it is that are at fault. For of what do the so-called mysterious relations between a man and a woman consist? As physiologists, we know precisely of what they consist. And take the autonomy of the eye. What in it justifies the guesswork whereof you speak? Such talk is so much romanticism and nonsense and unsoundness and artificiality. And when Bazarov first sees Anidintsova, he once again tries to play it as a physical thing. He gets defensive really quickly, especially since Arkady is also taken with her. You mean, what a splendid body, the very thing for the dissecting theater. But he is interested in her. All his bon mots fall away. He gets flustered, he rambles on. And when Anna tears the confession out of him, he is raw and exposed, and he hates himself and her for it. This feeling is so contrary and foreign to his entire being. He wants to reject it so much. And his ego is also wounded because she's rejected him. Anna doesn't really help the situation, especially later when she's implying that she might be interested in Arkady. But they're just toying with each other, trying to provoke a reaction out of one another. But this whole experience has a profound effect on Bazarov. He's shaken, he tries to find his footing, he tries to persuade himself that this feeling doesn't matter, that he is the same. Never have I got myself into trouble, and never shall any woman do it for me. But he is no longer the same man. Some critics imply that because of his youth, this youthful angst and maximalism, he cannot reconcile this feeling with his nihilism and rejecting everything else. Even in his last moments, when he seemingly accepts his feelings, that comes with the understanding that he's not going to play this grand role in the mankind's history that he envisioned for himself. It angered him to be the speck of dust in the grand universe, and it still does, but his last words are directed at Anna. He asks her to blow out the candle in a metaphor for his ending life. And interestingly, Odintsova, on the other hand, is not transformed by this experience. She's chosen her peace and comfort, and she's not willing to open herself to this whirlwind of passions and emotions. And mind, Anna is also part of the fathers, despite her trying to attach herself to Bazarov in her experience and worldviews. And so, in theory, that is also part of this conflict between fathers and sons, when fathers get to live out their lives and Bazarov does not. Another thing to mention about the love story is that it is likely either repeating Turgenev's own experience or at least very much affected by it. Turgenev, his whole life, was in love with this married, unavailable woman. Polina Verdot took up multiple lovers of her over the course of her lifetime, and some say that Turgenev and Louis would cry on each other's shoulders because of it. And on the surface, Turgenev gave both Pavel and Bazarov this cold, unavailable woman to love, but neither finds fulfillment in that love, and yet it haunts them throughout their entire lives. We don't know for sure what kind of relationship Turgenev had with Polina, but there is something there. Especially since Anna Odintsova is not a typical female character for Turgenev. Turgenev is known for a character type of Turgenev's girls. They're all shy, pure, innocent, not very pretty, but decently educated. They fall in love with the protagonist, and they are the only ones to see his true qualities, and so they follow him against all odds. Odintsova arguably could fit the definition of a feminist. She married her husband in an arranged marriage, outlived him, became a rich widow, about the only social life that women had available to them at the time. And I get the impression from her that she has her life figured out. Yes, she overpowers her sister a little bit, but that is to be expected. But the most telling thing for me is her treatment of Bazarov. She is interested in him, and God only knows why. They have some things in common, they relate, and all of that, yada, yada, yada. But when Bazarov shows her the true extent of his emotions, she is scared. Yes, she didn't want to disrupt her peace and comfort, but she also understands what Bazarov truly is and what lies behind that passion, and that is anger and rage. And over that boundary line she had peeped, and in front of her she had beheld, not an abyss, but a waste, a sheer ugliness. And there is still some discourse as to why Odintsova rejected Bazarov, but to me it's somewhat obvious. Bazarov tells her that she is incapable of love, but he isn't ready for it either. He might feel this love, but he cannot fully accept it or express it properly, so it's no wonder that it didn't work out between the two of them. From literary perspective, this is one of those books that people who are really into literature can nerd about. Turgenev is an amazing author. He received a wonderful education, so he genuinely knows what he's doing. He uses all of the possible tools at his disposal to create meaning and emotion. Look at the composition of the novel. Our protagonist, along with Arkady, travels the same route twice. We start with the Kirsanov, then we go to Odintsova, and then Bazarov. And while the first arrivals serve as new introductions and meetings, the second go-around is all dedicated to farewells. I like this scheme because look at the mirrored depictions of scenes. The first ones also serves as highs for Bazarov to only be followed by the lows in the second part. The events mirror each other, like the first confrontation between Pavel and Bazarov in the first part turns into a real duel in the second part. Characters also mirror each other, as advertised by the title. They are fathers and sons. It is most obvious with Pavel and Bazarov, but you also can see this duality in Nikolai and Arkady, in Odintsova and Katya. Turgenev uses varying tools to display it. For example, he uses the same descriptors to describe Nikolai and Arkady. They experience the same emotions, they display them in a very similar fashion, kind of foreshadowing from the very start that Arkady is going to move away from Bazarov and towards his father, as he ended up doing. Narratively, Turgenev uses varying POVs, sometimes interjecting as the narrator to give his own opinions. For example, such women are now extinct, and only God knows whether we ought to be glad of the fact. He also often interrupts the narrative to give his character's backstory. He's done that with Nikolai, with Pavel, with Anna Odintsova, but not with Bazarov. Bazarov is constructed out of lines and bits and pieces, and that is also done intentionally. Turgenev also carefully uses the descriptions of nature, sometimes to reflect the state that the characters are in, or to kind of drive home the main conflict. And honestly, there is rarely a word out of place. This book, this copy, is my dad's, and it's full of, I was using it as well in school, and it's full of things that I've underlined and made notes and everything. Every word is carefully placed to create meaning. I say that a lot, but for this particular book, it's truer than ever. Look at this. Look at this. I reread this book twice for this episode, once just to refresh my memory of it, and the second time, once I started researching it, I understood that I've missed a lot of small details, so I've gone through the book with a fine-tooth comb, kind of trying to see all of these bits and bobs, and it's an interesting experience. If you're interested in that, there is some of it is going to be lost in translation, but some of it is still going to be there. So I encourage you, if you are really nerdy about literature, to do that with this particular book. It's quite worth it. So if you're into literature, this is going to be an interesting book for you. And on a personal note, there is something in this story that tugs at my heartstrings. When I said that I don't like Bazarov, what I meant is that I don't like how he treats people. I can forgive a character for many flaws, even some of those that he displays in the story. I can see myself looking past them. What I cannot do is forgive him for the way he treats his parents. We see a little bit of the same problem with Nikolai and Arkady in the beginning, when Arkady is still very much under the influence of his friend and tries to look cool in his eyes and does not show any affection towards his father, who in response also tries to dial down his own excitement. Nikolai is portrayed as a gentle soul. He plays the cello, he reads poetry, and he loves his son so much. And so he reaches out to his son with open arms and open heart, to only be rejected by Arkady. He also tries to be one of the kids, and I see that. I feel the second-hand embarrassment when a parent tries to be friends with his child and his friends. I get that. And by the end, the relationship between Arkady and Nikolai is better than ever. They kind of find their way back to each other. But then there are Bazarov's parents. And I don't know what to tell you. They are described as gentle, warm people. They're so proud of their son, and they love him so much. On the first arrival, Bazarov's father asks Arkady whether or not he believes that Bazarov is going to be something great, and he is so moved and so touched when Arkady confirms. Bazarov, though, he rejects their affection. He does not appreciate it. He even makes fun of it. His mother, she dotes on him, but he does not care about it. He's even annoyed by it. And then he says that it's boring here, impossible to work, and he leaves after spending, 3 days after having been gone for 3 years. And his parents are devastated. They haven't seen him in 3 years, and he's leaving again. And he barely cares. And that honestly made me cry. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's my own troubled relationship with my parents. But there is that imagery in there when Bazarov leaves them. They are standing in front of their house, kind of leaning on each other, trying to comfort one another. And that's going to be repeated in the epilogue when they go to Bazarov's grave, once again leaning on each other, kind of trying to find comfort in one another when their son is gone. There is something in Bazarov's carelessness towards them that kind of stops me from appreciating him as a character. And that's a real shame, really, because apart from that, the book is great. I can see that being one of my favorites, but because of that, I simply can't.